have often wondered why certain figures appear in history not as gentle teachers or wandering philosophers, but as thunderclaps, shattering the sky so violently that their echoes never fully fade. Aleister Crowley was one of these thunderclaps. To speak his name is to summon a world trembling at the edge of two eras, the dying breath of Victorian restraint and the rising heartbeat of an age hungry for power, mysticism, and the freedoms of the spirit. I stand among the cracked foundations of that forgotten century, as if wandering the ruins of a temple built on fear and propriety. Gas lamps flicker like fading stars. Churches strain to hold their authority. The industrial world screams with metal and smoke. Yet the soul of man feels hollow, as though something ancient has slipped away. It was in this vacuum, this spiritual drought, that a new kind of seeker emerged. A seeker who wanted more than scripture, more than salvation, more than the polite whispers of a comfortable faith. Into this void stepped Edward Alexander Crowley, a young man born into a strict religious household, wrapped in the cold embrace of a moral code that forbade both questions and dreams. It is tempting to imagine him as merely a rebel pushing against his upbringing, but the truth is more profound. Crowley sensed the cracks in the world around him long before he set foot on the path of magic. He felt the dissonance of a society pretending it had all the answers, and in that dissonance something inside him stirred. Some would later call him a monster, others a prophet. Many simply feared him. Yet to understand Crowley, one must begin here in the twilight years of an age that was already collapsing under its own weight. He was not the cause of this collapse, he was its inevitable response, a mirror held up to a civilization that had forgotten its own shadow. I traced my hand along the dim corridor of that era, feeling the tremors of what was to come. The occult was rising from its long slumber. Secret societies whispered beneath the veneer of respectable society. Ordinary men and women, disillusioned by rigid dogma, began to search for something deeper, stranger, something dangerous. And into that simmering cauldron of spiritual hunger, Crowley brought fire. He did not whisper. He roared. He did not bend to tradition. He shattered it. He did not seek comfort. He sought truth, no matter how terrifying. This is where his story truly begins. Not with scandal, not with blasphemy, but with a world begging silently, desperately for a new kind of revelation. Crowley would answer that call, and the world would never be the same. His childhood was steeped in the strict piety of the Plymouth Brethren, a sect convinced that the world beyond their doctrine was a battlefield of sin and temptation. In such an environment, young Crowley was expected to kneel, obey, and never ask why. But even as a boy, he had a dangerous gift. He asked why anyway. I picture him wandering the cold English countryside, feeling the first cracks in the armor of inherited faith. While his mother warned him of devils lurking in every corner, he saw something else entirely. Possibility. He did not fear the demons she spoke of. He feared the prison of unquestioned belief. At Cambridge University, that prison collapsed completely. Here, Crowley discovered the forbidden joys of poetry, philosophy, chess, mountaineering, and the intoxicating sense that the world might be a riddle waiting for him to solve it. He fell in love with the thrill of ascent, both literal and spiritual. Scaling mountains taught him something profound, that danger sharpens the soul, and that the summit reveals truths invisible to the valley. It was around this time he encountered mystical writings that stirred something ancient within him. alchemy, the Kabbalah, the rituals of old esoteric orders. These texts did not frighten him, they felt like memories. Crowley's transformation was not gradual, it was a rupture. Edward Alexander died quietly somewhere inside him. In his place arose a seeker, a wanderer between worlds, the man who would soon call himself Aleister Crowley, and the world, though it did not yet know it, had gained a magician. It was inevitable that Crowley would find his way to the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, the most influential magical society of its time. Nestled in secrecy, populated by poets, mystics, and scholars, the Golden Dawn promised structured access to the hidden architecture of the universe. When Crowley arrived, he did not arrive humbly. He entered like a storm wearing human clothes. His initiations were swift. His aptitude was undeniable. Rituals that took others weeks to decode, he grasped in hours. He saw patterns in symbols where others saw only ink. He treated magic not as superstition, but as a science of consciousness. This brilliance, however, was paired with a flaw that would haunt him forever. Crowley demanded respect even before he earned it. The Order's established members, poet W.B. Yeats among them, saw him as a threat, a wild force bent on remaking the hierarchy in his own image. Tensions grew, lines were drawn, secret meetings were held in hushed voices. The conflict would erupt into one of the strangest magical feuds in history, a battle over authority, legitimacy, and the very soul of the Golden Dawn. Crowley ultimately broke from the Order, but not before absorbing everything it offered: ceremonial magic, Kabbalistic frameworks, astral workings, and the deep understanding that symbols are living forces. The Golden Dawn gave him tools. Crowley intended to build an empire with them. And though he left the Order behind, the fire within him only burned brighter. He had outgrown the gardens of other magicians. Now he wanted an entire kingdom. Cairo, 1904. Crowley traveled there with his wife Rose, expecting little more than an exotic retreat. But destiny has a way of finding those who refuse to live quietly. Rose began slipping into trances, whispering odd messages, insisting that a presence wanted to speak to Aleister himself. Crowley, skeptic and seeker both, put her claims to the test, and she passed every test. She pointed to gods she had never studied. She recited symbols she could not possibly know. She led him into a chamber filled with ancient silence. And on April 8, 1904, Crowley claimed he heard a voice that called itself Aiwass, a voice that dictated the book of the law, a voice that proclaimed the dawn of the Aeon of Horus. I imagine Crowley sitting cross-legged in that hot Egyptian room, hand trembling as he wrote. Whether one believes in Aiwass or not is irrelevant. What matters is this. Crowley felt he was receiving a revelation for the entire world. Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law. Those words burned themselves into him. They would define his philosophy, his identity, and his destiny. In that moment, the myth of the great beast 666 was born, not as a blasphemy, but as a symbol of liberation from outdated cosmic orders. Crowley did not claim to be evil, he claimed to be a herald of a new age. Whether he was chosen by a higher intelligence or merely chosen by his own ambition is a question the world still argues about, but the impact of that moment cannot be overstated. In Cairo, Crowley stopped being a magician. He became a prophet. Armed with the Book of the Law, Crowley began to build the spiritual system of Thelema, a system meant not to enslave the soul, but to awaken it. At its core were two commandments: "Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law. Love is the law, love under will." But contrary to popular misunderstanding, Crowley did not preach selfishness. Will, in the Thelemic sense, meant one's true divine purpose, the soul's authentic trajectory. To discover that will required discipline, courage, introspection, and often painful transformation, Thelema was not a rejection of morality. It was a rejection of hypocrisy. Crowley envisioned a world where each individual became a star, a being of light following its own orbit without colliding with others. He wrote extensively: rituals, poetry, mystical treatises, and guides for spiritual development. He saw himself not merely as a teacher, but as the architect of a spiritual revolution. And he embraced the title given to him by destiny or ego, the great beast, 666. To Crowley, the beast did not represent evil. It represented freedom, defiance, the courage to face one's own shadow. He believed that only by confronting the monsters within could humanity evolve beyond the chains of fear. And so he built the path of the beast and invited the world to follow. In 1920, Crowley founded the Abbey of Thelema in Sicily, a sun-bleached experiment in living magic. Here he sought to create a microcosm of the new aeon, a place where seekers could shed old identities and be reborn through ritual, discipline, and the pursuit of true will. But genius and chaos mixed uneasily in Crowley. The Abbey was equal parts temple and battlefield, rituals, meditations, poetry, art, and magical workings intertwined with scandal, rumor, hardship, and psychological strain. Some who lived there described profound spiritual breakthroughs, others described madness. Crowley's methods grew harsher, his health declined, financial problems mounted, and tragedy struck. The British press, always hungry for tales of the macabre, discovered the Abbey. They painted Crowley as a demonic figure, a corrupter of youth, a sorcerer dabbling in the forbidden. Their headlines branded him the wickedest man in the world. Whether fair or not, the label stuck. Mussolini's government expelled him from Italy. The Abbey closed, and Crowley, once certain he would reshape the world, entered exile. Yet even in failure, his myth only grew stronger. The beast had been cast out, but his shadow stretched farther than ever. The final chapters of Crowley's life were a tapestry of brilliance and ruin, woven together so tightly that it is difficult to separate the two. Addiction gnawed at him. Poverty followed him from country to country. Former students abandoned him. New disciples arrived with reverence in their eyes. He wrote feverishly, poetry, magical theory, reflections on his life, and warnings to the next generation of seekers. His mind, though battered by illness, remained sharp, luminous, unpredictable. There were nights Crowley glimpsed his own legacy stretching across centuries, and there were nights he feared he had wasted his life chasing illusions. I see him in a dim London room, leaned over his desk, candlelight flickering across worn pages. His hands shake, but his eyes still burn with that same volcanic intensity he carried as a young man. He knows he is fading. He also knows that myths do not die when the body does. When Crowley finally passed in 1947, only a few stood at his funeral. But they knew something the world did not. A giant had fallen, but his shadow would remain. His final words, "I am perplexed," echo like a koan across history. Was he bewildered by death, by God, or by the realization that he had become both legend and warning? No one knows. But the world he left behind had already been rewired. Crowley once wrote, "Every man and every woman is a star." He believed that each human soul carries a spark of the divine, and that the purpose of life is not obedience, but discovery. In this belief, he was centuries ahead of his time. Decades after his death, his ideas quietly infiltrated every corner of modern occultism. Wicca borrowed from him. Chaos magicians revered him. Counterculture movements idolized him. Artists, musicians, psychologists, and seekers found inspiration in his defiance. He transformed magic from superstition into a psychological technology. He reframed the self as a battlefield worth exploring. He gave the world permission to look inward without shame. Whether one sees him as prophet or pretender, tyrant or visionary, is irrelevant. What matters is that he changed the vocabulary of the esoteric world forever. Aleister Crowley was not merely a man. He was a crossroads, a point where mythology, rebellion, mysticism, and ego collided. He was the great beast 666, but more importantly, he was a reminder that within every human being lies a wilderness waiting to be explored. As I close this journey through his life, I return to the question that lingers like incense in the air. Was Crowley a madman pretending to be a prophet, or a prophet trapped in the guise of a madman? History has made its judgments, but legends are not bound by judgment. They are bound by memory. And Crowley, for all his brilliance, for all his darkness, will be remembered. You've been watching The Esoteric Unveiled, exploring hidden orders, forgotten truths, and forbidden knowledge. Like and subscribe.